finish all of Acts chapter 25 this morning, which is a good 27 verses, and we're going to as well dive into Acts 26 for the first 8 verses. And primarily the reason why we're doing that is because it's a continuation of the same story. And much of the text as a narrative speaks for itself. That doesn't require much to expound on. But I also want to preface one of the reasons, and maybe some of you may not actually know this, but the breakdown between verses and pages and chapters, all of that is not inspired. God's word is inspired. It was like basically 1244, 1248 AD is when they started incorporating verses and chapters. So I can say things like, hey, turn your Bibles to Acts 25. So we can all be thankful for that time that they incorporated that, because otherwise we'd be sitting here forever trying to figure out where Acts 25 was. But I preface all that to share it's going to be the same story continued, and there's a lot to cover. So let us begin in verse 1 of Acts chapter 25. It says this. Now, when Festus had come to the province, after 3 days, he went up from Caesarea to Jerusalem. Now, here in Acts 25, we have a completely different governor, procurator, than we did in chapter 24. 24, we saw Felix. Felix, as I told you, was a corrupt man. He was made immoral, bad decisions. History tells us he just was a tyrant. But Porcius Festus, here in Acts chapter 25, was known to be an honorable man. He governed well, despite given basically the mess to clean up that Felix left him. And so Festus, in a way, he's like the new sheriff in town. And he decides, I'm going to take a trip to Jerusalem to kind of see who I'm going to be talking with and the people that will be answering to me. And look who he runs into as he visits the Holy Land, a.k.a. the mothership, in verse 2. Then the high priest and the chief men of the Jews informed him against Paul, and they petitioned him. Now, for some of us, this may be really exhausting. Like, I thought they covered this. I thought this was taken care of. Well, don't forget that Paul the Apostle has been in Caesarea for 2 years under Felix's authority, imprisoned. And although that might be, because he's waiting for his final verdict. But we know that this isn't a complete bad game changer, because he wrote all of the prison epistles that we have in our hands today, between Ephesians and Philippians and Philemon. And he was able to write to these churches while imprisoned under Felix's rule. And one of the things he wrote in Philippians, if you remember Philippians, he basically, well, actually, before we get to that, I want to preface, he's in prison, he's waiting for his final verdict, and it's not done. And it made me think of famous cases where basically the one being tried had to wait. Primarily, I'm thinking of the O.J. Simpson trial in the 90s. Now, for those of you who love and remember that or were alive during that, just by raising hands, who was born after 1995? Raise your hand. Okay. For those raising your hand, do you know the color and the make of the car O.J. Simpson was driving that made the news all over the world? It was a white what? Can anyone tell me what John Elway was driving that year? No one can. And you want to know why? Because O.J. Simpson made national news, and it blew up on the media. Completely blew up. And not to mention, the judge decided to televise this, which is why it got such great attention. In fact, I'm going to read to you a source that said something pertaining to this case. It says, this case was the most publicized criminal trial in American history. Simpson was acquitted after a trial that lasted more than 8 months. In fact, when the final verdict happened, if you remember where you are, October 3rd, 1995, it was said that 140 million people tuned in to hear what the final verdict was, because he was basically accused of killing Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman. Wow. And here's the crazy thing. When the jury was gone for 4 hours, I did a statistical analysis online to find out how much the U.S. economy lost in those 4 hours. over $400 million because everyone stopped what they were doing to finally listen. That means for every hour the jury was gone, the U.S. economy lost $100 million to hear what's the final verdict. Paul the Apostle in Acts chapter 25, he's waiting for his final verdict. Some of you know that court cases can take months, they can take years, and in Paul's case, he's waited 2 years to hear what was going to happen, which makes you wonder what would have happened if Paul's case was televised today, if he was on trial for the same thing. The Sanhedrin in Acts chapter 25, they're hoping that Festus, who is the new Roman procurator, is going to finish what Felix couldn't. And Felix, what they were hoping to accomplish was to kill Paul. That's what they've wanted from the beginning, and that's what they want now. You'll see what I mean. Look at verse 3 with me in Acts 25. It says, asking a favor against him, that they would summon him to Jerusalem while they lay in ambush along the road to kill him. There it is. There's the motivation. Hey, Felix wouldn't do it. Festus, you should ask Paul to come to Jerusalem to try there. But they don't know. He doesn't know that they were wanting to ambush him. You know what they're doing? They're treating Festus like a substitute teacher. You know why? Some of you are giggling under your breath because you remember how you treated your substitute teachers? Yeah, you're kind of pushing the limits. You're kind of saying like, I wonder what I can get away with the substitute teacher because, you know, your normal teacher is a no-nonsense person. And then all of a sudden, all the kids become these little Dennises, the menaces. And again, it made me think of like parents in the room. It's like when you send your kids to the grandparents, and it's almost, I'm talking to the grandparents in this room. Follow me. I've heard this from so many grandparents. Like, I raised my kids this way, but with grandchildren, I'll let them do whatever they want. And it's like, my mom is not this way. My mom's a no-nonsense Mexican woman. So, like, if anything, she puts them in line. It's my lovely mother-in-law, Kelly, who will come to me tied up, and she's like bleeding, and she's like, they found me. Where are the kids? Well, they were so cute, they tied me up and threatened to end my life. And it's like, why didn't you do anything? And she's like, it's fine. It's not fine, grandparents. Shame on you for letting your grandkids do whatever they want. And the reason why, my kids have like a British accent when they're around me. They know how to behave. They're like, oh, dearest father and mother, your wisdom enriches us greatly on how you teach us to behave publicly. But when they're with the grandparents, it's like, game on, we can do whatever we want. Oh man. You guys are like, this is digressing, John. Let's move on. The priests, the Sanhedrin, are looking at Festus. You're our sub. Let's see what we can get away with. We're going to ask a favor to bring Paul to trial, but we just learned at the end of verse 3, they want to lay an ambush along the road to kill Paul. They obviously didn't tell Festus their intention with that because Festus was by the book kind of a guy. He knew the rights of a Roman citizen, and he wasn't going to be a pushover to let them do whatever they want. Because look at verse 4 and 5 with me. But Festus answered that Paul should be kept at Caesarea, that he himself was going there shortly. Therefore, he said, let those who have authority among you go down with me and accuse this man to see if there's any fault in him. So Festus doesn't necessarily slam the door at their request, but he also isn't a pushover to let them just decide whatever. He wanted to, in my opinion, this was a political move. He wanted to earn favor with the Jewish community. And I think for him, he's looking at this as a way to kind of gauge how they were. Either way, Festus wanted to make sure that they knew, the Jewish community, that he wasn't a pushover. He wasn't that substitute procurator that's going to let them do whatever they want. Festus wanted Paul to exercise his Roman rights as a citizen, get a fair trial. Read verses 6 and 7 with me back in Acts 25. When he had remained among them more than 10 days, he went down to Caesarea. And the next day, sitting on the judgment seat, he commanded Paul to be brought. When he had come, when the Jews had come down from Jerusalem, stood about and laid many serious complaints against Paul. Look at this next part, which they couldn't prove. They could not prove any of the complaints. Paul at the judgment seat. And many, as you noticed in the text, serious complaints were against Paul. But the beauty of this for Paul is he's listening to it, and he's just like, none of this is true. You can't prove any of this stuff to be anything but it's false. And it makes you wonder if the Sanhedrin just started making stuff up as they went along. Like, we got to come up. Yeah, Paul's got a ton of unpaid camel tickets that he hasn't paid for. Yeah, he threatened to kill me. He vandalizes the temple. He hates puppies. There it is. They just started making up complaints against Paul. But Paul was happy to answer because he knew the things that were falsely being accused towards his way, he could basically refute it. Look at verse 8 with me. While he answered for himself, this is Paul, and he's probably giggling as he's saying it, neither against the law of the Jews, nor against the temple, nor against Caesar have I offended in anything at all. For Paul, it's like, seriously, guys, come on, we've covered this. But this is normal. This is normal that we see biblically with a lot of characters, and it's normal that we should be expecting as Christians today. Some examples of people who were falsely accused in the Bible, the first coming to mind is Joseph in Genesis. Remember, Potiphar's wife sees Joseph and says, I like Joseph, I want to have me a Joseph sandwich. And Joseph's like, no, that ain't happening. And he runs from her, but she accuses him of raping her. And then you have another case where you have Daniel in the Bible, where Nebuchadnezzar's administrators try to trap him. And the text tells us that they were searching for some fault in the way Daniel was handling these government affairs, but they couldn't find any fault in him. And one of the primary reasons is because he had a clear conscience. They had clear consciences. They had nothing to worry about. But for a lot of you, I don't need to explain this to you. When you're falsely accused, when you hear someone is falsely accused, it boils your blood. I can't stand this, John. These false accusations left and right. But you know what the Bible has to say about it? There's so much to say. There's actually so much to say. But you know what Jesus has to say about it when we're falsely accused? Listen to this. Matthew 5:11. What does Jesus say? He said, blessed are you when they revile and persecute you and say all kinds of evil against you falsely for my sake. Some of us might read and hear that verse, and you don't look at false accusations as a blessing. You're not like, I'm so blessed that I'm being falsely accused all the time. For some of you, it's like, this is punishment. That's such a reoccurring theme I hear from people in the church. It's like, John, I do everything right, I do this right, and it seems like I can't catch a break, or these things come my way, and I didn't even do anything wrong. Can I just help the Western church's thinking when it comes to persecution? And I mean this in the most loving way. But we can't limit our idea of persecution to only physical opposition or torture. Jesus is the one who said it, that a form of persecution is, and you're blessed when it happens, when people revile you and persecute you and say evil things against you falsely. And can I just say this? As much as we want justice, persecution, when you are falsely accused, listen guys, persecution will always feel like a blessing when your conscience is clear. When you have an attitude. And remember, the simple definition of having a clear conscience, it means you're not hiding anything. You're not covering your tracks. You're living a life that is open as people ask questions. And for Paul, his conscience was clear. He had nothing to hide. I'm happy to share what has happened with me. Because look what happens in verse 9. Festus responds by saying, but Festus, wanting to do the Jews a favor, he answered Paul and said, well, are you willing to go up to Jerusalem and there be judged before me concerning these things? And you got to know the Sanhedrin are like leaning in. Is he going to do it? Is he going to say yes? And Paul's like, okay. No, he doesn't do that. You know why? Because the last time Paul the apostle was in Jerusalem, they tried to kill him twice. And so it makes sense why Paul answers the way that he does. Hey, will you come to Jerusalem? Paul says in verse 10, I stand at Caesar's judgment seat where I ought to be judged. To the Jews I've done no wrong, as you very well know. As you very well know, verse 11, for if I'm an offender or have committed anything deserving of death, I do not object to dying. But if there is nothing in these things of which these men accuse me, no one can deliver me to them. I appeal to Caesar. I mean, this makes perfect sense. Paul isn't reacting because he's a coward. Paul isn't saying this because he doesn't want to go to Jerusalem and die. Paul's not afraid of death Because Paul, like Peter Pan in the movie Hook, would say something like this: death would be a great adventure. You know how I know that? Because the same prison epistle that he wrote when he was in Caesarea wrote this in Philippians. Check this out. This is how I know Paul wasn't afraid of death. Philippians 1:21, for to me, to live is Christ, but to die is gain. Paul will also say in 2 Corinthians 5:8, to be absent from the body means what? To be present with the Lord. It doesn't mean that he's suicidal. He's not saying these things because he's being dramatic. For Paul, it's like, guys, if I'm alive, that means I'm living for Christ. But if I'm to die, it means I'm with Christ. In Paul's mind, it's a win-win, which is why he said in verse 11, if I'm an offender, if I've committed anything deserving of death, I do not object to dying, because it is a win-win for him. But he knows he didn't do anything illegal. And if he did do anything illegal, then I will deal with the consequences and I will gladly take it. But what I love about Paul is he doesn't just leave it there. He pulls the trump card. Did you notice what he said at the end? I appeal to Caesar. That's like basically Elizabeth Swann from the Pirates of the Caribbean saying, I invoke the right to parley. Unfortunately, Elizabeth Swann, only pirates can do that. And unfortunately, Paul, oh wait, not unfortunate. He's a Roman citizen. That's exactly what he can say. I invoke the right to appeal to Caesar. And so, and by the way, for those of you that are not familiar historically at this time, who is Caesar in power? Does everyone remember? It's Nero. For those of you that know Nero, most of you, and if not, let me educate you. Terrible man. Murderous, vile man. He would take Christians, he would persecute them, and more than just persecute them, he would get animals and basically let them maul and destroy Christians. He would light Christians on fire in his garden, and it was said that he would ride around in his chariot naked to light up his garden. I mean, this man was messed up. And so to give you that context, understand this though, historically, according to Acts 25, none of those things have happened yet. Meaning the first 5 years of Nero's reign, he was under the influence of good men. Nero was known before all of that as someone who was surrounded by wise counsel, before he was a murderous, evil persecutor. And there's a principle behind that. And I want to just preface this for a moment. Paul the Apostle said it. Some of you maybe have heard this and you're like, that's in the Bible. Maybe you've heard this. Evil company corrupts good habits. You may think, and I just want to preface this, everyone, I have your attention. You may think that the people you surround yourself has no level of influence on your life. And you may think that this is a time where you can be around people that don't revere the word. And let me just preface this. There's a difference between being in the world and of it, being a light and an example, and occupying certain principles that people have that are not honoring God. And you may think that the people you surround yourself with won't have those consequences. I'm here to tell you that evil company does corrupt good habits. So when you surround yourself with men and women who revere the word, so when things are weird, because we're in the world's evil, but at least at this point, we can share and be a representative. And for Nero, that was a time before all that he was known to be a just guy. So for Paul, context now, Acts 25, he has no reason to believe that Nero is anti-Christian because he hasn't murdered Christians yet, to the degree that we're familiar with historically, which is why Festus says this in verse 12. Then Festus, when he conferred with the council, answered, you appeal to Caesar? To Caesar you shall go. You want to talk to the big man? Absolutely. Let's make this happen. Because again, as a Roman citizen, if you felt like your rights were violated, that you were not deserving or receiving a fair trial, then you can appeal to Caesar. Verse 13, and after many days, King Agrippa and Bernice came to Caesarea to greet Festus. Now, I told you guys last week that King Agrippa came from the Herod family. The Herod family, remember, they're dysfunctional. It's like the Osborns meets the Manson family times 4. They were messed up. We know this historically, we know this biblically, because remember, for example, King Agrippa's great-grandfather, he's the one who ordered every male boy to be murdered in Bethlehem when Jesus was born. Remember that story? King Agrippa's father, Agrippa the First, he's the one who ordered James to be killed by the sword that we learned about in Acts. His great uncle, he's the one who put John the Baptist's head on a platter after he basically gave permission to behead him. In fact, it was said, history tells us, it was safer to be a pig in Herod's kingdom than to be one of his kids. And the reason for this is because the Herods were known to kill their own children and wives if they sensed a hint of disloyalty. And you thought your family was dysfunctional. It just gives you this perspective. So here you have King Agrippa II here in Acts 25, the last of the Herods who really plays a big, significant role in the New Testament. And again, just to give you more context of how messed up these guys were. After his father died, his sister Bernice and him shared in the ruling together. And to complicate this family dynamic more, Herod's sister was also his lover. She got involved with her brother Agrippa after she divorced her uncle. Everyone say that's messed up. Because it is messed up. I mean, it's just like, what? This actually happened? Yeah, and these are the people that Paul's going to appeal before. Look at verse 14. When they had been there many days, Festus laid Paul's case before king, saying, there's a certain man left at a prison by Felix. And I can imagine King Agrippa's like, hey, how are you liking your new position as the Roman procurator? And he's like, yeah, it's interesting. You know, I've got this case with this Paul guy, and he keeps talking about Jesus. The Sanhedrin hate him. Verse 14, saying that there's a certain man, read it with me, in prison by Felix, verse 15, about whom the chief priests and the elders of the Jews informed me. When I was in Jerusalem asking for a judgment against him, to them I answered, verse 16, it's not the custom of the Romans to deliver any man to destruction before the accused meets the accusers face to face and has opportunity to answer for himself concerning the charge against him. Verse 17 and 18. Therefore, when they had come together without any delay, the next day I sat on the judgment seat and I commanded the man to be brought in. And when the accusers stood up, they brought no accusations against him of such things as I supposed. Meaning, Festus was confused, but he's kind of surprised, thinking that the Jews' accusations against Paul were unimportant. Really, Festus, he's looking at the accusations as like, this is an issue of your religion. Why are we involving Rome in this? He hasn't done anything illegal under Rome's charges in terms of what we would count as something illegal. It would be like one of you going to the Jefferson County Sheriff's Department. And you're like, I'm here to report a crime. And the officer's like, what's the case? And you're like, well, did you see my wife wants to go to church on Saturdays, but I want to go to church on Sundays, so we need to take this to court. The officer would look at you like you're crazy. Why are you here? Go to your church. Deal with it there. This has nothing to do with us. That's exactly what Festus is doing here in Acts 25. Why are you bringing this to me when this has nothing to do with me? But you know what? You appeal to Caesar, you're a Roman citizen, let's entertain this, even though you're not doing anything illegal. Verse 19. But some had questions against him about their own religion and about who? A certain Jesus who had died, who Paul affirmed to be alive. You see, the issue that is at hand is that Paul was preaching a message about a resurrected Jesus, about a Jesus who you saw die on a cross, but is alive today. And for obvious reasons, the Sanhedrin, who made up of that Sanhedrin were the Sadducees, completely reject the doctrine of resurrection. So they're upset. And they're looking at this as, Festus, you need to stop him. And how do we stop Paul? By killing him. This is the only way that we can make this work. And I want to point out another thing, what Festus calls Jesus in verse 19. Did you notice the wording? They had some questions against him about a certain Jesus. The certain Jesus who had died. And you know what the wording indicates to me? It indicates Festus doesn't know anything about Jesus. And I mean, that's no fault to him. I mean, you have to understand, historically, Christianity is rising at this point, but it's not at the point because the moment Paul makes it to Rome is when Christianity is going to explode. The very thing that they're trying to stop proceeds to explode as a result of Paul's faithfulness to go to Rome. But Festus, he has no idea who this Jesus is. And it reminded me of a quote by Charles Spurgeon. It's been a while since I've given a Spurgeon quote, but Spurgeon said this concerning this text. Brethren, this is why we must keep on preaching Jesus Christ, because he is still so little known. The masses of this city are as ignorant of Jesus as Festus was. And you know what? It made me realize, even though we have access to any translation of the Bible on the internet at our fingertips, there are still people who know very little about Jesus, who know very little about his characteristics, the hope that we can have in Jesus, the forgiveness that is found in Jesus, the new life that is found in Jesus. And we live in a society that says, talk less about Jesus, let's do entertaining speeches and sermons and all this stuff. But the reality is, people like Festus in the Bible are going to have questions about Jesus. And the question is, how are we going to answer them? Is it portrayed by the Western way of thinking of how we see Jesus? Is it a lack of knowledge? And you know what's going to help rectify that is reading the word. So when people have questions about Jesus, you point them to his word. We need less links and things shared on Facebook to share the truth about who Jesus is. We need to share the truth about Jesus according to his word. We need to give him Jesus. That's exactly what Paul's about to do. Read verses 20 through 21 with me. And because I was uncertain, this is Festus still speaking, I asked whether he was willing to go to Jerusalem and there be judged concerning these matters. But when Paul appealed to be reserved for the decision of Augustus, because remember he appealed to Caesar, I commanded him to be kept till I could send him to Caesar. So Agrippa at this point, he's intrigued. His curiosity is spiking because look what he says in verse 22. Then Agrippa said to Festus, I also would like to hear the man myself. Tomorrow, he said, you shall hear him. Festus is probably so happy because he knows Agrippa is an expert in the Jewish law. And he's going to be able to hear Paul and be able to basically dissect everything that he's saying. So look what happens in verse 23. So the next day, when Agrippa and his incest sister wife, creepy lady, it doesn't say that, Bernice, had come with great pomp. Everyone say great pomp. Great pomp. They had entered the auditorium with the commanders and the prominent men of the city. At Festus's command, Paul was brought in. So, Bernice comes in with great pomp. And in the Greek, that word translated pomp is fantasia, which we get our English word fancy from. She came in dressed for the occasion. She looked fancy, this great pomp idea that she looked fantastic. She had her royal Prada robe on, her Gucci shoes. She was dressed for the occasion. And then here she comes in. And then who comes in after her? Peasant tent maker, Paul the Apostle. And you have to notice something that in the text, these people who are in there are the distinguished, well-dressed. And there's nothing biblically unwrong about being well-dressed. I just need to preface that. But there is something wrong when you assume that your academics, your job status, the very thing that from a society's position, I make who you are and identify you as this prominent person because of this status. I mean, it's a lie. It's all a lie. For Paul, he came in as a tent maker being accused among the elite. In fact, you know what's something you wouldn't see Paul on? Preachers with sneakers. Did you guys know that Instagram account? It's hilarious. It's basically all these like national pastors that are wearing amazing like clothes, blah, blah, blah. And what they do, it's actually really messed up. They take a picture of the pastor and then they show how much whatever they're wearing cost, those shoes that were like $9,000 or something crazy. I want to preface something that my Converse that I'm wearing have holes in them and there's burn marks in them from my bonfire. You will not see me on preachers with sneakers. John, what does this have to do with the Bible study? Nothing. Let's move on. So here comes Paul, peasant, humble Paul. He entered the auditorium with the commanders and the prominent men of the city. At Festus's command, Paul was brought in. Now, this isn't just a couple people. This is hundreds of people listening to Paul's case. You have the legionnaire who are there, who are the most formidable soldiers of antiquity. They're the bodyguards of the Herod family. You've got in the auditorium Stoics, philosophers, prominent people, politicians present, and they're all there to hear whatever Paul has to say. And I can imagine Festus gives the permission for Paul to come in, and they're looking at him, and they're like, who is this guy? Because historically, Paul was not known to be eye candy. That's right. Check this out. Historians describe Paul as this: a short man with bowed legs, a long hooked nose, little hair, and runny eyes. Mr. Burns from The Simpsons. I mean, is anyone else saying that? He just comes in excellent. I mean, that's Paul. He wasn't this great looking guy, which I just want to admit a couple things before the church. Who knows David Crowder in here? David Crowder's music. Has anyone ever seen what David Crowder looks like? He looks like a goat man, right? Like when I first heard David Crowder, I'm like, this guy has an amazing voice. And you see him, you're like, oh, you got to know that's love when someone marries that. Anyways, so here comes Paul. David Crowder's behind me, isn't he? Just kidding. Here comes Paul, and you probably wonder if Bernice and Agrippa, King Agrippa and Festus, they're looking and they're like, who's this short, bald, hooked-nosed little man? What does he have to say to me? And man, what a sight it must have been. The tent maker coming to share the gospel of Jesus. He entered the auditorium here in Caesarea. By the way, this auditorium still exists today. When we visited Caesarea last time, it's beautiful. It oversees the Mediterranean Sea. And I'm just imagining when we were there last time, Paul appealing to King Agrippa with the ocean breeze on his back. And he has this moment and the freshness of the air reminding him of God's promises and faithfulness, that this needs to happen. And by the way, what's happening here in Acts 25 is prophetic fulfillment that was prophesied over Paul. Remember when Ananias comes to Saul, who later becomes Paul in Acts chapter 9? What's interesting about that passage is that Ananias doesn't want to see Saul because he's the Christian persecutor. But then Jesus prophesies over him and says, Ananias, you need to go. Why? Acts 9:15, Saul is my chosen instrument to take my message to the Gentiles and to kings as well as the people of Israel. This was nothing new. This was something that Jesus said to his disciples. Luke 21:12, same thing was prophetically prophesied over them. But before all this occurs, there will be a time of great persecution. You'll be dragged into synagogues and prisons, and you will stand trial before kings and governors because you're my followers. I'm pointing these things out to show you the amazing connection of the word, that this is not new to Paul. This isn't like, Paul, why is this happening to me? Paul knew this is what the calling on his life was. And then Festus says here in Acts 25, King Agrippa and all the men who are present with us, you see that this man about whom the whole assembly of the Jews petitioned me, both at Jerusalem and here, are crying out, look at the wording, that he is not fit to live any longer. We need to kill him, basically. Verse 25, but when I found out that he had committed nothing deserving of death, and that he himself appealed to Augustus, I decided to send him. I have nothing certain to write to my Lord concerning him. Therefore, I have brought him out before you, and especially before you, King Agrippa. So after the examination has been taken place, I may also have something to write. Again, the narrative is speaking for itself, and especially you, King Agrippa, because he was an expert in the law. This is what's happened. I have no idea. You're an expert of the Jewish customs. I don't even know what to write to Caesar because he's done nothing illegal, which is why verse 27, for it seems to me unreasonable to send a prisoner and not specify the charges against him. Yeah, good detective work, Festus, which is why now we're going to continue. Turn your Bibles to Acts chapter 26. It says in verse 1-2, a continuation of the same story. Then Agrippa said to Paul, you are permitted to speak for yourself. So Paul stretched out his hand and he answered for himself. I think myself happy, King Agrippa, because today I shall answer for myself before you concerning all the things which I am accused by the Jews. Yeah, Paul's excited about this. Hey, I'm stoked to talk to you. This is an amazing opportunity. I get to preach the gospel to you, to the Stoics, to the philosophers, to the legionnaire. Everyone here is going to be able to hear Jesus. It's an amazing privilege, which is why in verse 3 he says, especially because you are an expert in all customs and questions which have to do with the Jews. Therefore, I beg you to hear me patiently. See, Agrippa wasn't just knew a thing or two about Judaism because he watched a YouTube channel that someone sent him and then he watched it for a couple hours. He actually was an expert in these customs. And that's huge for Paul to say, because we're going to find out here in a second. Look what Paul said in verse 4. My manner of life from my youth, which was spent from the beginning among my own nation at Jerusalem. Look at this last part. All the Jews know. Well, what do they know exactly? Well, they know that Paul lived under the tutelage of Gamaliel. He studied under Gamaliel's teaching, who was revered in Jerusalem. He was known as a teacher who revered the law. So anyone that was trained by Gamaliel knows their stuff. And Paul knew his stuff. Look at verse 5. They knew me from the first, and if they're willing to testify that according to the strictest sect of our religion, I lived a Pharisee. He's pointing out, I lived like these guys. You're right to believe that I've done nothing illegal in Rome's eyes. And they should know, because of my upbringing as a Pharisee, I've done nothing illegal according to the Jewish law. But what they don't realize, and he's going to reveal it here in a second, is he found Jesus after he was on the road to Damascus. He understood that the law could reveal his sin, but the law could not remove his sin. Only Jesus could do that. Paul was like the Jew of all Jews. He was like the future when it came to the law. Like he was the prototype and the poster boy among the Pharisees. And then he points out in verse 6 and 7 of Acts 26, now, and I'm going to read to you the New Living Translation. So I'm shying away from the New King James because I really liked the New Living Translation of the last verses. Verse 6, now I am on trial because of my hope in the fulfillment of God's promise made to our ancestors. In fact, this is why the 12 tribes of Israel zealously worship God night and day, and they share the same hope that I have. Yet, your majesty, they accuse me for having this hope. He's given them a history lesson that they're completely familiar with, that Agrippa is familiar with, that the 12 tribes of Israel placed their trust in the hope that God was going to fulfill his promise. That Paul is basically saying that this promise was fulfilled in Jesus Christ. The very prophets, the very ones that the prophets spoke about. Like he's looking at them like, I'm on trial because of the hope that I have in Jesus, and you guys are familiar with this. We read the scriptures pointing to this coming Messiah, and it's Jesus. And it's my opinion that Paul knew King Agrippa was aware of these prophecies, and it is also, and this is conjecture, but it is my opinion that Paul thought what a great story this would be. To help Agrippa understand, because he was familiar with the Jewish writings and customs, that everything that you are familiar with in your expertise of the Jewish law, that was speaking of Jesus. That's why I'm on trial. That's why I'm here. And for Paul, it's like, man, I get to witness and hope maybe lead one Herod to Jesus. Because for Paul, he dedicated his life to the knowledge of having this hope in Jesus. And he poses a question with that knowledge that I want you guys to ask yourself in the last verse, verse 8. Apply this for yourself. If you know that Jesus is the hope of our future, that Jesus has spoke about, and he is fulfillment that the prophets spoke about, then ask yourself this question that Paul poses. Verse 8, read it with me. Why should it be thought incredible by you that God raises the dead? It's a great question. Because a lot of the religious leaders there, just like many of you, you believe you were born with a purpose. I'm here, I gotta be here for some reason. I'm created for some purpose. The Jews present at this case, they believed the purpose, or they more specifically, they embraced the covenant God had made with the Jews. They knew the stories God had, how God shared in various ways through the prophets. Like, they're completely familiar with all that. And then Paul poses the question, so if you know God's done all these things, if you know that the prophets spoke of a coming Messiah, then why is it a shocker to you that God can raise the dead? It makes you wonder about today. Maybe you've met this person, people like this. Maybe you're this person. I embrace the Bible, John. But there's certain parts of it I don't embrace. Maybe it's because if it's offensive, or maybe because you don't believe it. And you really think it's impossible? Let me pose a couple questions for you. If God spoke you into existence, if God knew you before you were in your mother's womb, is it really a shocker to you that in the beginning God did create the heavens and the earth? That he made the sun stand still? That he used a punk shepherd to kill a giant? Does it shock you that he preserved the life of a disobedient prophet in the belly of a great fish for 3 days without the stomach acids killing him off? Does it really shock you that God is capable of great things, of things that rationally make no sense on paper? Does it shock you that if God can save you and get a hold of your life, then he can get a hold of someone in your life that you think is impossible to be saved? Should it shock you? Because we serve a great God. That's why the psalmist said in Psalm 145:3, guys, listen to this verse. Great is the Lord. He is most worthy of praise. No one can measure his greatness. The New Living Translation is, his greatness, no one can fathom. It's overwhelming sometimes when I'm reminded what I was saved from. It's overwhelming sometimes that God wants to speak to me through his word, that God wants to impart wisdom to me and reveal truth in his promises through his word. God, you're so good. We serve such an amazing God. To which is why Paul says, is it really a shocker to you that God can raise people from the dead? His greatness has no measure. And you know why Jesus rose from the dead? It's to fulfill the promise that he is God, but he rose from the dead so that you too can rise from the dead. That Jesus says, anyone who believes in me, though he die, will live. We don't serve a fable or a false God. We serve a God that is alive today as he was when this was written. And I'm reading this, and if there's any form of encouragement that you can receive this morning, it's to remember this, that he conquered death so that you too can conquer death, that your life exists to share the hope of Jesus and what he's changed for you, so that you can point people that are dying and needing some ounce of hope to say, the hope that I have, when they look at your life, well, the reason why I have a hope is because I follow Jesus. The worship team's going to come up, and I want to just add this last thing before we enter into worship, guys. It's hard to hear when people are falsely accused of things, when you are falsely accused of things. It doesn't feel like a blessing, even though Jesus told us, blessed are those who, when they revile you and persecute and say all kinds of evil against you. And for some of you, it's like, it doesn't feel like a blessing. But I'm here to tell you that if you have a clear conscience, that your life exists to be an open book, that you're not covering your tracks, but you have a clear conscience, that persecution will always feel like a blessing when your conscience is clear. I don't know about you guys, but it's time to get our priorities straight. It's time to place our hope in the promises of Jesus that's declared in God's word, that we can say with confidence, great is the Lord. He is most worthy of praise, and no one can measure his greatness.